contribution. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Melbourne Ports.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. This government likes to talk the talk on infrastructure, but it doesn't seem to be walking that walk. Yesterday, the member for Grayndler, in an excellent speech on infrastructure, gave the minister credit for his chutzpah, his cheek, in talking about infrastructure. Coming in here, he said, when Victoria is getting 8 cents in every dollar in the national infrastructure budget, when it got $0 this year, 0 next year, 0 the year after, 0 the year after that, and 0 the year after that, right through to 2021. This budget, the member for Grayndler argued, means that the minister came in here and speaks about Victorian infrastructure without any content to what he's saying, without any real contribution. Of course, the member for Grayndler pointed out that this is a budget which cuts $1.6 million from infrastructure investment this year. It's a budget that said it would be $9.2 billion, instead it's $7.6. After that, it falls off the cliff. It cuts out $7.4 billion in actual infrastructure investment over the forward estimates, down to $4.2 billion. That's what the peak body Infrastructure Australia, Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, that's why they say the budget confirms the cuts to the real budget for capital funding to its lowest level in more than a decade, using a mix of underspend, reprofiling and narrative to cover this substantial drop in real capital expenditure. The former Prime Minister, the member for Werra, used to talk about he wanted to be known as the Infrastructure Prime Minister. He failed, instead being known as a failed Prime Minister. We now have the current Prime Minister in the Lodge and his Treasurer holding the purse strings that this government continues the previous Abbott hockey tradition of cutting $1.6 billion of total infrastructure, as the member for Grayndler said, in this financial year alone. From there it only gets worse, and over the next 4 years, as he says, plunges to $4.2 billion in 2021. It's the lowest level of infrastructure spending in more than 10 years. Now, on the 11th of May, I spoke in the House on the Turnbull government's apparent vendetta against Victoria when it comes to federal transport infrastructure spending. Since the budget, the unfair allocation of funds from the Sydney-centric government of the Prime Minister and Treasurer has become more apparent. No wonder the Victorian Treasurer, Mr Tim Pallas, said in an article entitled "Infrastructure Spending Shortchanges Victorians," and which has been strongly supported by the Herald Sun newspaper, not necessarily a friend of the opposition. He said in his opinion article, at budget estimates, the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development confirmed that the federal budget did not include a single extra dollar for Victorian infrastructure. This is despite the fact that the Treasurer is claiming he'd make $1 billion available for regional rail and infrastructure projects in Victoria. Now, of course, this is a terrible situation where we have 37% of our national migration coming to Victoria. Victoria is 25% of the Australian population, and Melbourne is moving towards the biggest city. If you stand on a crowded tram or train in Melbourne, you will think very fondly not of the current government. And perhaps it's why it looks very unlikely that the current government will win any support in Victoria, because commuters know that they are being encouraged to come to Victoria. There are lots of economic prospects there, but we are being deliberately shortchanged on infrastructure spending by the current federal government. And you can tell it as the population moves in to Melbourne. There is a lot of expenditure by the state government on removing level crossings, on improving the rail service, and improving the tram service. As the city grows to more than 4 million people, of course you've got to have more public transport, but you can't do it without federal government support. Now, I applaud the Victorian government's decision to sell the Port of Melbourne, particularly since it was done with some sensitivity to overseas strategic interests. They managed to get $9.7 billion for the sale of the Port of Melbourne, and the Victorian government is ploughing that back, as it should, into public infrastructure. And in southeast Melbourne, people can tell. It's been very intensive in some areas around some stations, but those level crossings have been removed. I can tell you, for instance, the McKinnon shopping centre has been absolutely transformed. Not only has it given a great boost to local traders, but traffic and trains move quicker and more efficiently, as the whole idea of spending money on public infrastructure by the Victorian government is underlined by the transformation of that very important Frankston line from the city down to the far southeast. In the year leading up to 2016, the Bureau of Statistics estimate that a third of Australia's population growth has settled in Melbourne. Currently, Victoria's share of interstate and international migration, as I said, is 37%. Given Victoria's population growth, some people would call it an explosion, it would be reasonable to expect that a fair share of Commonwealth infrastructure funding would match this clear need for transport options to keep pace with population. The Victorian government, as I said, has done its part. 50 dangerous level crossings are being removed. They're widening the Tullamarine, Monash, Westgate and Western Ring Road freeways, building the Westgate tunnels, linking the Port of Melbourne to the freeway system, a very important thing in my area. And most importantly, we want to extend the Melbourne Metro Rail project with $2.9 million of tunnels and 5 new stations. This is where the federal government should be coming in. This is what we're not getting, and this is Australia's biggest city. We're not talking about we're going to be in the future, like the Deputy Prime Minister talks about inland rail going and boosting inland cities, which may be a worthy project in itself. We're talking about the here and now, with Australia's biggest city being completely underdone by this government, and they will pay the political price for it. They will pay the political price, as they should. According to its own budget papers in the Infrastructure Investment Program, the amount allocated under Victorian infrastructure investments, the amount of federal funds allocated to Victoria in 2016-17 is, as the member for Grainless said, zero. Zero. Yeah. For 2018-19, zero. 2019-20, zero. And in news that will probably not surprise anyone, for 2021, it's again zero. The Turnbull government, in its budget, raises infrastructure funding projects that have Commonwealth funding attached. However, these are for projects that have already been funded. There is no new funding at all for Victoria, with the Commonwealth rivers of gold all running to Sydney, it would seem. New South Wales has served up a healthy 39% slice of infrastructure spending pie. It's not our fault in Victoria that successive New South Wales governments, including, I might say, the hopeless Carr Labor government in New South Wales, failed to spend money on infrastructure in New South Wales. We've been spending it through the years as population has increased, and Victorians shouldn't be penalised for the incompetence of New South Wales state governments and now their allies in the Liberal federal government trying to make up for their incompetence of their state colleagues. To its credit, and despite the Turnbull government all but starving the state of funding, Victoria's continued with its ambitious infrastructure agenda, planning for our population to reach 8 million by 2040. Public Transport Victoria's annual report shows that over the financial year ending 2016, passengers on Melbourne's V line grew by an amazing 19.4% in 1 year, while trams saw a passenger increase of 12%. I know the most popular tram route in Australia runs through my electorate, the number 96, which is sort of like an inner ring road or ring tram that goes from one side of Melbourne Ports right across the member for Melbourne's electorate, linking people through the CBD right across the city. In 2050, Public Transport Victoria has projected an increase of public transport users by 80%. These levels of passenger growth are simply unsustainable without huge investment in the state's transport infrastructure, something that the current federal government refuses to address. The Prime Minister, under pressure on this issue, told David Koch on Sunrise that he loved Melbourne and he loved trams. However, these are hollow words when he refuses to put his money where his mouth is or fund either. Days before the federal budget, we even saw the Victorian opposition leader Matthew Guy forced into the admission that his federal Labor counterpart was leaving Victorians stranded on transport infrastructure spending. Earlier this month, I held a press conference with Labor Shadow Transport Minister Anthony Albanese at the proposed domain interchange of trams, trains and a large shopping centre, South Korean style, third storey down underneath it, to highlight the unfairness of Turnbull's lack of support for our great state. The member for Grainler put it quite simply. The Prime Minister does visit Melbourne. When he visits, he takes selfies on trains and on trams. What Victorians want is for him to fund trains and trams, not to take selfies on them. Now, the member for Grainler is a New South Welshman. He's taking a more objective view of how our national infrastructure ought to be spent. This was the contract underlying federation, that all states would be taken fairly and be given a fair amount of infrastructure of the national tax take. When this is persistently disadvantaging Victorians, 25% of the population, the fastest growing state, the state that's standing up and taking responsibility for 37% of national and interstate immigration, we just want, as the former Prime Minister used to say, a fair suck of the sauce bottle. It's not fair that Victorians being so shortchanged. Well, he was imitating Bazza McKenzie, and some people were trying to humanise him by making him able to say sayings that appeal to the average Australian. Anyhow, the federal government still owes Victorians $1.45 billion under the Coalition's own asset recycling scheme after the lease of the Port of Melbourne. This, because the Victorian government managed to get more money, 9.7 than the projected 6.5, it was penalised by the current federal government and didn't get the asset recycling money that is mandated to come to state governments that sell infrastructure and redeploy it for good infrastructure uses. There's an incentive by the federal government which was not fulfilled for that extra portion of the sale price that they got. Infrastructure spending future-proofs our nation on population growth and provides employment for thousands. I remember when the Prime Minister used to say jobs and growth all the time, jobs and growth, jobs and growth. Now it's abundantly clear he's abandoned that strategy. Sydney is a wonderful city, New South Wales a great state. It's silly to have interstate rivalries that go back to federation, but people will naturally feel this if we are getting 8% of expenditure with 25% of the population and 37% of national migration coming to Melbourne. Now, we're a very cosmopolitan city. People are willing to stand up, doesn't concern them at all, but we want a fair slice of the national tax pie. And this current federal government is undermining that contract implicit in federation. Australia is the nation of the fair go. Victorians just want a fair go on infrastructure.
I thank the member for Melbourne Ports. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for